Welcome, everyone. Thank you for trickling in. Good morning, good afternoon. Just allow for a few more seconds for me to admit participants from the waiting room, please. Great, thanks everyone for joining. We have a few more people coming in. As we wait for some more people to trickle in, I wanted to take this chance to kindly remind everyone to share feedback on yesterday's session. The link was sent via email. We would really appreciate your thoughts and feedback on the session yesterday so that we can make sure to adapt it in the future to your needs and desires. So just quickly pasting the link in chat again for the feedback form. And we'll have one on today's session as well that will be handed out at the end of the meeting and then sent via email as well. Okay, I see a couple more people coming in. Nico, would you like to share your screen in the meantime so we can quickly go over the agenda for today? Thank you so much. And I know we also want to take some time to reflect on yesterday's session, so excited to do that at the beginning of the meeting before we dive into the content for today. Great, and just a quick reminder for the webinar etiquette, please be on camera if you can. And if you do not have any questions, we kindly ask you to please keep your microphone muted. And as with every discussion and webinar, we highly encourage you to jump into the conversation when it feels necessary. So again, while this is more of a presentation and well, today will be more hands-on and more application focused, but we really encourage you to feel free to raise your hand, come off mute at any time, ask questions, and be as engaged as possible. Okay, I think I don't see anyone else in the waiting room. Great. So, oh, a few more people, sorry. Okay, so this is our agenda for today. We'll cover well, the main topic for today is application of financial models to minigrids. We'll, as I said, have a quick recap of yesterday's session just at the beginning and take some time to reflect on main takeaways and things that you learned and that surprised you from yesterday's session. And then we'll dive into today's topic with 1 hour overview for on the theory side, covering in which ways are minigrids different from on-grid and off-grid solar, financial solutions for minigrids, financial modeling approaches, and a few related use cases and tools. And then, as I said, today's session is really more about the applications. So we'll have a hands-on practice exercise and discussion guided by our experts. Great. With this, I'm happy to hand it over to Nico for a quick recap of yesterday's session and for facilitating our reflection.
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to those who have attended yesterday's session already, and welcome to those who decided that they are advanced in financial modeling and not only attending today's session. Welcome all. Let me just summarize quickly what we have done yesterday to onboard those who have not been present yesterday. Yesterday, we went through the basics of financial modeling. We've had a look at the components of a full financial model, which are, of course, the profit and loss or income statement, the cash flow statement, and the balance sheet. And we looked at the various components and how these are structured and how a financial model in an Excel spreadsheet looks in general, where you have the columns for each year and then the lines for the different items. After that, we had a look into how the cash flow model works, what compounding interest is, what a discounting of cash flows is, how we can derive a net present value from that, and how we can derive an internal rate of return from that. And with that knowledge, we then looked into some other KPIs that you would find in financial models or that you could derive from financial models and what these KPIs are good for. Finally, we then left the full financial model, but took the knowledge from that and went into the cost of service model, which is a slightly different approach to financial modeling, which is more used by governments, by people who want to monitor projects, by regulators who want to regulate tariffs, that uses a kind of profit and loss type of approach, but calculates a tariff for each individual year by just having the data for that 1 year, and which doesn't require a 20 or 30 years projection of cash flows and revenues and costs and these kind of things, which would be required for a full financial model and which would be required to calculate the NPV and the IRR and other KPIs. So that is what we did in the presentation, and in the last 5 or 10 minutes of our session yesterday, we then looked into a very simple financial model and ran through a quick task of how we could bring down a tariff that was very high in this financial model by changing the assumptions and changing the project design step by step. And we succeeded finally in bringing the tariff down from some $0.80 per kilowatt hour down to roughly $30 per kilowatt hour by adjusting the grant levels and the size of the project. And we understood that economies of scale actually have a significant impact on the profitability of a mini-grid project, especially considering then the operational cost that could be used more efficiently. Yeah, that is the quick summary, Valentina, of what we have done yesterday. Maybe you want to collect some feedback from the participants that were there yesterday.
Yes, thank you, Nico. I would love to do that. Yeah, so if there are any reflections or general questions that came to mind, we're happy to pause now to hear those. Otherwise, our prompt for today was, what is one thing from yesterday that you took away, or what is one thing that surprised you, that you learned that you maybe did not know jumping into the session yesterday? We would love to hear from the participants today. Is there a brave volunteer? We did receive some positive feedback in the form, so we appreciate that, and would really love to hear some comments and reflections, if possible. Doesn't sound like. Oh, Faris, yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, it was definitely a useful refresher. I mean, the first time that I was exposed to income statements and cash flow statements was in graduate school, which I'm a bit embarrassed to admit was 24 years ago. So, and then of course, as RTA, you know, we do review financial models, but I definitely picked up some points yesterday, and I thought the presentation was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We appreciate it. Any other questions, reflections? takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, you can also totally share what you maybe would have liked to see that wasn't discussed, or, you know, anything. Pretty much it doesn't have to be, you know, all positive. So, you know, you can, we are totally open to any feedback.
Yes, thank you, Maria, for pointing that out.
They can type on the chat as well, just in case.
Yeah, the chat remains open. The form for feedback is also linked in chat, so please feel free to use all and every channels to share your thoughts and ideas and feedback, both positive and constructive. Again, we are really aiming to tailor these sessions to what is most useful. Well, yeah, I think in the interest of time, we are happy to move on. We have a packed agenda for today. So I'm happy to hand it over back to Nico for our theory section.
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. Let me share my screen again. Valentina already introduced the agenda, so we can go to the next slide and directly jump into the subject. And we would like to start with an overview about in which ways mini-grids are different from on-grid and off-grid solar. Because I understand that many of you come from MDAs of various African countries, and you may have been involved in PPA-related IPP projects, like independent power producers, where large wind turbines were like wind projects were designed and implemented, where large solar PV systems were designed and implemented and connected to the national grid, to the main grid. And others may have been in contact with companies or associations or NGOs which provide solar home systems, standalone systems to health centers, to households, to residential clients and customers. And these are, after all, completely different from mini-grid. So don't expect too many takeaways from what you have learned on the other projects, because mini-grid financial modeling is completely different from what you know from IPPs or from solar home systems. And now we would like to quickly go into where the differences are. So let's first compare mini-grids to independent power producers. The independent power producers, IPPs, are, as I said before, like hydropower projects that feed into the main grid, main distribution network, main transmission network. Solar, megawatt, multi-megawatt size solar projects, or megawatt or multi-megawatt size wind projects that feed into the main grid, transmission or distribution. So after all, it's not just the size that is different here. Some may say, yeah, but these are large projects and mini-grids are small projects. But this is not the case, right? There are also megawatt and multi-megawatt mini-grids in Africa, by the way. But the main difference is that in an IPP, you have a power purchase agreement. And in this power purchase agreement, there is one clause that says that the operator of the system, let it be a solar PV system, 10 megawatt peak in one place, connected to the transmission network, that this operator has the guarantee that all kilowatt hours that this plant produces will actually be taken by the main grid and will be compensated for in terms of a tariff that is also fixed in the power purchase agreement. And that is for 20 years or 25 years or 30 years or even more. In some cases, maybe 15 years, but it's at least for a long time. And therefore, in power purchase agreements that IPPs use, and therefore in IPPs, you don't have any demand risk. So whatever you produce, you can sell everything. And that is completely different in mini-grids. And that's the main difference between IPPs and mini-grids. In mini-grids, you have your, I don't know, 1 megawatt peak of solar photovoltaic. You have your batteries. And the photovoltaics produces electricity no matter if somebody consumes the electricity or not. If there's too much electricity from solar, then the inverters will make sure that the solar PV panels derate. They simply don't produce as much as they could. And therefore, you basically have surplus electricity or excess electricity in mini-grids that you cannot sell. So you only sell a certain fraction of the total number of kilowatt hours that you can produce with your generation assets in a mini-grid. That is called demand risk. And after all, there's no guaranteed offtake of electricity, and therefore there's demand risk because you are a retail business, right? You generate, you distribute, and you sell. And the customers only take as much as they like, as they need. The customers will not guarantee you, I will take whatever you produce. No way in mini-grids. They will only take as much as they need. And in some cases, it may be 20% of what you could produce, meaning 80% of your electricity you don't earn any revenue for. In some cases, it may be 50%, 60%, 70%. In some cases, it's close to 100%. But that is the limit, right? You can never sell more than 100% of what you could generate. So therefore, you are at a very much higher risk as a mini-grid operator compared to an independent power producer. And that, of course, then also needs to reflect on the financial model, right? In a power purchase agreement, it's relatively easy to project the cash flows over 20 years, right? Because according to the PPA, you already know that you can sell everything that you generate. There may be a little bit of a derating every year. Every year, the PV panels get a little bit less efficient, right? They produce a little less every year. But that is something that you can project and calculate easily. In mini-grids, you cannot say, oh, well, next year, there will be an increase in demand, and then finally I get from 30% of my electricity that I generate, I sell 30%, I get up to 80%. You cannot easily say that because, well, for that demand increase, you would need to have a lot of productive use. You would have to increase, have a lot of income increase on the consumer's level that then triggers that additional demand. But this cannot easily be projected. And therefore, in mini-grids, it's difficult to project a cash flow over 20, 30 years because you simply cannot say what the demand will be in 20 years. Maybe there is a large factory that has been set up. Maybe no factory has been set up in 20 years. Maybe there are some entrepreneurs which have great ideas to produce anything from around the community and sell it to the next city. Maybe there's no one with any good idea and everything stays as it is, right? You cannot say. So now let's compare mini-grids to standalone systems. Standalone solar systems here, they basically sell the service not as a kilowatt hour service, like they don't sell the kilowatt hour of electricity, but they sell the system on a lease basis, right? And therefore, customers rather pay for the system. And then after all, once they have paid off the system, they even own the system. So people just calculate with a fixed payment. And well, if the system meets all their electricity demands or not, well, that is the customer's risk. That is not the system operator's risk. In the mini-grid case, it's different, right? People pay for the kilowatt hour. If they don't get their full demand covered, they will complain with the mini-grid company and say, hey, we're paying per kilowatt hour. Why are you switching off our electricity? This is not the case in the standalone system. So in mini-grids, there is one more aspect. The project runtime is determined by the concession agreement or the license agreement that you receive from the regulator or the government as a mini-grid company, or that you as government provide to the mini-grid company. So if you limit the time, then you basically increase the demand risk to a certain extent. In a standalone system, this is different, right? In a standalone system, you basically have the system lifetime, and the system lifetime is the payoff time, so to say, from a customer's perspective, but not from a provider's perspective. The provider just uses a certain payback period, right? And these are kind of two different worlds that should not be confused with each other, same as with the IPP system and the Minigrid. Good. Now, as we know that IPP systems and Minigrids, IPPs and Minigrids don't have much in common, and standalone systems and Minigrids do not have much in common either, let's have a look into how, like, what determines Minigrid's profitability. And as I already mentioned, the demand risk is the main factor in making Minigrids profitable. Just as a repetition, as a reminder, like if you just sell 20 to 30% of what you could theoretically generate, and you had paid all the capex for a large system, and then after all, you just use it by 20%, and your revenue is very small, very much smaller, 20% of what you initially projected, 100%, and you just get this out of this, then after all, you will not be profitable. Most likely your system will, your company will die, right? You will go bankrupt. So now let me add a little bit more flavor to this kind of demand risk discussion. Now, if you look at a diesel Minigrid, like no solar, no hydro, nothing, just diesel, right? You have a cost and a revenue curve. Here on the y-axis, you have the cost and the revenue. Here is the revenue curve. There is the cost curve. And on the x-axis, you have the annual electricity sales. On the further right you go, the more kilowatt hours you sell in that year. Now, the y-axis interception, where the curve actually meets the, or intercepts with the y-axis, on the revenue side, is basically a fixed revenue that a customer pays, like say they have to pay 50 cents per month or so as a fixed payment just for being connected to the system. And then the inclination of the curve is basically the variable tariff component, what the customer has to pay per kilowatt hour. And therefore, the total revenue increases the further right you go on the annual electricity sales on the x-axis, right? On the cost curve, it's the same thing. Like in diesel, you have a certain fixed cost, which is again the y-axis interception. And then you have an inclination, which is then the variable cost. And diesel generators is mainly diesel fuel and lubrication oil, filter change and these kind of things, right? So after all, the more kilowatt hours you sell, the higher the cost. And then there should be, like to have run a profitable system, there should be an interception between the cost curve and the revenue curve. And you see the interception here in this diagram. On the right side of that interception, you have more revenue than cost. If you subtract one from the other, you generate a margin, so to say a profit. Yeah. If you stay on the left-hand side of that interception, you have more cost than revenue, which means if you subtract one from the other, you have a negative margin, which means you run a loss, right? And running a loss over a certain period of time means you go out of business. So you should make sure that you stay on the right-hand side of the interception. Then there is another vertical line on the right-hand side of the diagram. This is the capacity limit. More than this, a diesel generator cannot generate. So therefore, if you want to do more than that, you need a larger generator. This is the diagram. So therefore, well, you have a very relatively wide range of the viable demand slots. Like this is the demand that Minigrid customers all together could have in a village. And you could be profitable and run the system and be sustainable. And then we look into a different type of system. Like this is now a solar battery diesel system, where the cost curves look a little different. I just remember we had some feedback that said, well, Nico, you're talking so much about private sector companies, but we, like most of the audience is actually public sector, from governments, from ministries, from MDAs. Yes, I know that. The aim of whatever I present is to make you aware of how private sector thinks, because after all, you as government, you're expected to set the rules of the market with grant funding programs, with support mechanisms, with capacity building, with as a regulator, with tariff setting, for example. And to do that, you need to understand under which conditions private sector can be sustainable and can operate mini-grids in the long run, and under which conditions private sector may even be attracted to invest in the large scale. And that will be the final goal, right? We want to set frameworks, grant funding programs, tariff structures, and so on, site selections, all these kind of things, to attract private sector, to electrify rural areas with mini-grids for us, right? For us as the state, as the government. So now let's go back into this diagram. And I just wanted to say quickly why I'm looking at this from a private sector's perspective, mainly to make you aware what the private sector needs to be sustainable and to enable you to set the right framework to attract private sector and private sector investments to electrify rural areas of your country. Good. So now we have another diagram here, same structure. On the y-axis, you have the cost and the revenue. On the x-axis, you have the annual electricity sales. Again, you have a curve. The revenue is the same curve as before, again, with the fixed and the variable component. And here, on the cost side, the curve has changed. Like, as a reminder, this was the old curve. This is the new curve. Because we added solar to the equation. And solar has a lot of fixed costs. So therefore, the y-axis interception is very high. And the inclination of the line is very low, right? There is very little variable cost. So therefore, the inclination is very, very small. A lot of fixed cost, meaning a very large, high y-axis interception. And this is the point, the number of kilowatt hours per year where the diesel generator starts operating. And then you basically have the diesel generator curve added to this curve. And that has, of course, a very high slope, like a high inclination, large inclination, because the variable cost, the diesel fuel cost and the lubrication oil cost, they are high in the diesel generator operation, other than in solar PV. So now you see that before, before the interception between revenue and cost was down here somewhere. Valentina, do you see my cursor or don't you see my cursor?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay. It was here somewhere at the bottom of the curve. So now it moved further to the right. So after all, the demand slot shrinks with solar introduction. That's dangerous to a certain extent. Of course, everyone wants renewable energy, right? We want to reduce CO2 emissions. We want to reduce dependence on diesel fuel imports and transport and all the environmental issues with diesel fuel usage in rural areas. Like, we want to avoid that to the extent possible. But if we introduce solar or other renewable energy, then we reduce the demand slot within which the mini-grid can be operated sustainably. So now if you're here, you go bankrupt, right? Because you run losses. Cost is higher than revenue. So therefore, well, you need to somehow move the demand up into the demand slot. And we will talk later about how this could be done. Now let's look at a solar battery only system, like only solar battery without diesel, right? So after all, you have a very, very small demand slot, a tiny demand slot. How do you fit that in? Like, if you go further to the right, then suddenly you cannot supply all the demand. because the demand is too large than what compared to what your generation assets can handle. So unsatisfied customers, because you have electricity outages very frequently, load shedding, not nice, right? And if you run a financial model, like your cash flow model with the IRR, like internal rate of return calculations that we looked into yesterday, and you have 15% IRR in your optimized model, then these 15% are usually calculated for the optimum point where you sell all the electricity that you could generate. So now what happens if you just sell 5% less, or did I say 10% less, maybe here, then probably your IRR has already dropped from 15% to 7 or 8%. And then if you go to, say, 25% or even 20% less, your IRR is 0, right? Just 20% less electricity. And before, we talked about that you cannot project how much electricity you will actually sell. And we said in some cases, you just sell 30% or 20% of what you could potentially generate. Right, 30 or 20% here means you run a huge loss. The costs are significantly higher than the revenue. So that is the risk. That is the demand risk in solar mini-grids. But also like in hydro mini-grids and wind mini-grids, it's the same thing, right? Everything that has a high fixed cost component, high installation cost, high capex, high depreciation over time, and that has a relatively low variable cost. So what can we do? We can, for example, implement the project in stages. So you can have, as AMP staff, like as representatives of government, you can, for example, say, okay, well, we have a 5 years project implementation timeline. In year 1, we ask the people to set up the project, but let's ask them to set up a small project first. And then we see when the demand will hit this limitation here, and when suddenly they run into load shedding. And then you add some additional grant and say, now extend the system. Extend the system and shift the whole curve to the right, yeah? And then suddenly this small slot moves to the right, and you can again have a profitable and sustainable business. And maybe you can do 2 stages or 3 stages of implementation. And we will look later into how demand typically develops in mini-grid over time. And then you can see how the staged implementation could actually be implemented. So, and here we go, demand growth in mini-grids. Like, this is real data from a mini-grid program that was implemented in Bangladesh in the 1920 years, something like that. 2019 to 2018 to 2020 years, in that range, maybe 2021 even. What you see here is different curves, demand development curves from different villages. On the y-axis, you see the percentage of the demand compared to the design expected load, so to say, to the design capacity of the system. And on the x-axis, you see the month after commissioning. So after 3 months after commissioning, you get the first data points, and some start off with some 30% of the projected demand, some start off with just 5 or 3% of the projected demand, right? And then the demand increases. And the interesting thing here is that all these different villages have been evaluated using the exact same demand evaluation methodology. And it was even an advanced methodology, like I explained yesterday, where they actually considered the willingness to pay and the ability to pay and linked the demand to the willingness and ability to pay. But after all, some of the villages reached the expected load, the design load, after 1.9 years, some after 2.6 years, some after 3.1 years. And if you extend this curve down here, you will probably end up with 5 years or so, right? This is just an example which I'm using to show and to make obvious that demand projections in mini-grids are very, very difficult to make. It's impossible, basically, to project demand accurately, especially before the first electrification of a village. Once you have a trajectory here, you can probably indicate how this trajectory will move, like will be looking like in some future years. You could say, okay, well, this may continue for some 1 to 3 years, and then it will go flatter. And what I also need to say is that all these villages also have seen similar productive use support schemes. So even if you implement the same thing in different villages and do the same evaluation in different villages, you will get different outcomes, right? It's just to repeat once more, it's impossible to get the demand projections 100% right. Usually, these demands follow a trajectory which looks like a square root curve, right? If you look back here, then you could also see, okay, here there are linear interpolation curves, but if you look from here, then it's basically something like a square root curve, even here, square root curve, also down here, right? It goes up relatively steeply in the first month, and then it goes a little bit flatter, right? Like this curve here. But you cannot say which of the trajectories, 1, 2, or 3, a demand development will take. It depends on so many things, right? It depends on how well the mothers are connected to their sons and their daughters in the cities, and whether the sons and the daughters bring televisions or other electric appliances for Christmas or for any other celebration or for birthday or so, right? It depends on whether you have 1 or 2 or 3 very clever, smart entrepreneurs in the community that set up nice businesses that consume electricity. All these kind of things you cannot easily evaluate before electrification. You can only say, okay, this will take this trajectory once you are in the period of electricity supply. Good. So, and after all, this all leads to the conclusion that we need to have some flexibility in the project design and the project funding, like staged implementation, as I said. So now let's look into some numbers, because if you go into financial modeling, you need to make a lot of assumptions, and some of the assumptions are revenue. What revenue can you expect? And there has been some evaluation by the African Minigrid Developers Association, AMDA, and this is the report from 2022. There will be a new report coming out in a few weeks that will have more updated information. Please make sure that you get that report and then include it into your financial modeling exercises. So the average revenue per user and month, right, I have to say, can be as low as $2, right, for new sites, and growing to $10 for more established sites. And if you now look into the 2016, 2017, 2018 reports of AMDA members, you see $8.60, almost $10, $10, $4, and then it reduces. In 2019, probably because a lot of mini-grid companies established new sites that start at a relatively low level, right? Same in 2020. All sites on average, over the long term, $4.4 per month. So that is the expenditure, the budget that an average mini-grid customer in a rural area in Africa has. That is what we can expect. So this is now the consumption. So you see that you have 8 kilowatt hours, 10 kilowatt hours, 5 kilowatt hours per month of consumption per user per month. And now if you look at the distribution of electricity demand across customer groups, it's probably not that surprising that there are some companies that produce the lion's share of electricity in mini-grids, right? here you can see like 12% of the users can represent up to 50% of the total demand. Right here, you see, for example, that you have consumers that consume below 1 kilowatt hours per month. 31% of the consumers do that, and they consume 8% of the electricity. Whereas 4% of the consumers, like just 4 out of 100 consumers, consume more than 35 kilowatt hours a month. And that, after all, results in 31% of the total electricity consumption, right? So therefore, there must be some kind of focus, right? Focus on the productive users, focus on the businesses that exists into the community, or focus on the entrepreneurs that can set up these businesses that consume that larger amount of electricity. Good. Now, as we have an understanding and a feeling of what level of consumption and revenue per customer we are looking at for our financial models on the revenue side, there is one very important aspect that has been overlooked in financial modeling for decades, right? Financial modeling of mini-grids over, especially in the 2010s and up to the 2015s, have always assumed that if you increase the tariff, automatically also your revenue for the mini-grid company would increase. But in the meantime, there have been experiments that show this is not the case, right? Most of the customers, and that is what we also see here, right? Most of the customers are actually customers that consume very little. Just a few kilowatt hours, 1 kilowatt hour, up to 4 kilowatt hours, right? So this is already 60–70% of the customers. 70% of the customers don't consume more than 4 kilowatt hours a month. So therefore, these customers, after all, they have a fixed budget, so to say, right? They have a budget per week that they're willing to spend on electricity. So now if you increase the tariff, they wouldn't just spend more, right? These customers would just say, okay, well, I just have this budget. I don't spend more. I spend the same amount. I simply consume less. I can just watch less television. I can need to switch off the lights earlier at night. That's what they do to make sure that they don't spend too much. So, and that's what you can see here in this curve. This has been an experiment conducted by the Minigrid Innovation Lab. And Maria, who is also here today, has been actively involved there, and cross-boundary access was in the lead. So what they did is they went into Tanzania, into existing mini-grids, which were in operation for a few years, and they artificially reduced the tariff by 75%, right? They gave the lost revenue, so to say, to the mini-grid company as a grant, as a subsidy, just for experimental purposes. And they said, okay, what happens to the demand if we bring down the tariff by 75%? So 3/4. So what happened is that the demand, so this is the total revenue, this is the demand curve. The demand, of course, it took a bit of time. These are the months. Here, this is before the intervention, and this was the point in time when the intervention took place. That is where the tariff dropped by 75%. And then it took a little bit of time, and the demand increased, and it increased, and increased, up to roughly 3 times, right? Surprising. You reduced by 3/4, right? If you and then by you multiply by 3 to 4 somehow, and then you get to the same budget. And that's what you see here. Basically, customers were using the same budget, more or less, for their electricity expenditure, which means, after all, that as a regulator or as a government setting the tariffs for residential customers do not make such a big difference to the mini-grid companies once the sites and the plants have been established. The only thing that you can change with setting the tariff, like if you increase the tariff, you would see the customers would reduce their consumption. So therefore, if you have a mini-grid system, like think of a solar system that is close to its limits, right, and cannot supply more electricity, and there are already electricity outages, if you increase the tariff, suddenly everyone would get what they could pay for, right? So if you reduce the tariff, then you need a larger system, right, to cover all the demand. So that is the message that I want to send here. That's residential customers. What we also investigated in our own mini-grids, and I said yesterday that I'm not just a consultant, but I also run mini-grids in Uganda and Tanzania. And we do that to run experiments with these mini-grids and try out new business models and also do these kinds of exercises. And what we found is that productive users actually, if you increase the tariff, you actually get an additional revenue as a mini-grid company. Because productive users consume as much electricity as required to produce all the products or services that customers buy. So if somebody comes to a miller and says, well, I have a bag of maize, can you mill this? The miller would never say, well, but I have used up my daily electricity budget. No, as long as he can make a margin, of course he takes the bag and mills it and hands back the flour and says, okay, this costs you this much. As long as he can make a margin from that, the consumption will always go with the demand for products from the end customer side. And now whatever I said, you can also put into diagrams. And here are the diagrams. On the productive user side, you have the demand and revenue again on the y-axis, and then the tariff this time on the x-axis. So if you increase the tariff, then the revenue increases, the quantity stays more or less constant, well, depending on the demand for products. But the demand for products is constant more or less, because people will not eat more maize flour if the electricity price reduces, right? It doesn't make sense, right? So therefore the quantity stays constant and the revenue increases. And yeah, so that is very nice. That is something that a regulator can work with very well to make mini-grid companies sustainable, or to, if mini-grid companies become too profitable, reduce the tariff for productive users, for example. On the right-hand side, you have a similar diagram for households. And here you have a curve. And the curve shows that the quantity, like, let's start with the revenue. So the revenue, as I said, is a budget. So it's always constant, independent of the tariff, right? It's a budget. They have a weekly amount of money that they want to spend on electricity. They don't deviate from that, the households, like low-income households. But there is, and they adjust the quantity to always meet that constant revenue. After all, there is a saturated demand, a saturation level. Like if the tariff goes down to, say, $5 per kilowatt hour or so, $3 per kilowatt hour, can even be higher, then people can afford all the electricity that they would potentially want to use. And then they say, okay, well, if I can really saturate all my electricity demand, then let's save some budget. Let's save some money on my budget that I allocated and I can use it for something else, right? That is the saturation up here. Good. So now this is an important aspect that we need to consider in our financial models. And now don't get shocked. This is a little bit complex here. This is now the financial modeling iteration cycle. Yesterday, we just looked into the financial model and assumed this is a constant, like one tool thing. You just need to calculate your system sizing with a design software like Homer or PVSys or similar. And that goes into the model, and everything is just assumptions and data, like some of the data I already showed, like demand data, ARPU, average consumption per user per month, and so on, and CapEx and OpEx and so on. And then you can calculate your tariff, or you put your tariff in, and then you get your profitability. But in reality, This is not the case, unfortunately, because we have the price elasticity. And of course, you put in all the data, right? All the energy resources, electricity demand data, and you put them into the power system design tool, as I just said. And then you get your capital expenditure from your system sizing and the operation expenditure. And then the company's specific cost structures also flow into the cost onto the cost side, into the operation expenditure. And then the financing components, everything we discussed yesterday, into the financial model. And then you put in your initial electricity tariff, and then you calculate. But as soon as you change your electricity tariff, you also change your demand, right? Remember, residential customers have a fixed budget as a like first iteration, right? If you change your tariff, they consume less. If they consume less, then you need a smaller system. So you need to run your power system design tools again. So therefore, the financial model, after all, is just one step in an iteration cycle. And this iteration cycle typically converges relatively easily. So after all, you run this 2 or 3 times, and then finally you have kind of a stable outlook of what the profitability may look like. Good. Now we have had a look into price elasticity of demand. Maybe if someone has a question, this would be a good point in time to ask this question. If you think everything I said was bullshit, tell me. This is the time for it. If you doubt that some of my findings are correct, this is the time to put that into the chat or raise your hand or just unmute and tell me. Good. Doesn't sound like it, doesn't look like it. Good. Then let's look into the next subject, economies of scale and fixed and variable cost. You remember these diagrams where I said with the y-axis interception and then the slope of the curve is the variable cost, represents the variable cost, and the y-axis intersection represents the fixed cost in a renewable energy mini-grid. And now I would like to just explain to you what these fixed and variable costs are, right? Fixed costs can be accounting costs, right? You have to have a back office, general management, legal and tax advisory, public relations, government interaction. Don't underestimate the cost of government interactions, right? Some governments expect mini-grid companies to fly in from rural areas, which is extremely expensive. And remember, yesterday we just said, okay, we have some $45,000 of total OPEX for everything, for the variable and fixed cost, and then add a $500 flight. This is already a significant component to go and just see the government and report, right? So be careful as government in your demand for reporting, because that increases the fixed cost of a company. Government interactions, IT costs, right? You need mobile money integration, you need reporting, you need customer relationship management through SMS, through ticketing systems, you need your call center potentially. And then, well, of course, there's all this asset maintenance on the generation as well as on the distribution side. And a large component is, of course, also customer service, which is more fixed than variable, because independent of whether you have a customer who consumes 1 kilowatt hour per month, as we have seen before, or a customer who consumes 100 kilowatt hour or 500 kilowatt hours per month, these customers probably have the same questions and call you the same number of times. So therefore, it's more a fixed cost than a variable one. But you also have variable cost. Variable means that it goes linearly with the number of customers and sites or the kilowatt hours sold, right? Fixed cost means it's independent of the kilowatt hours sold, right? Variable cost means, like examples for variable costs are travel costs, for example, right? If you have more sites, then you have to travel to site more often. If you have more sites, then you need more on-site staff. If you have more customers, you need to have more on-site staff, more people on-site. If you have a diesel generator, of course, diesel fuel is the largest variable cost component. And now how does that reflect in the economies of scale? As we said before, if you have fixed cost and variable costs here, and then you have a very small electricity sales, like you are financially unsustainable. So now if you have the same fixed cost and add a little bit of variable cost, like think of fixed cost as, well, these are the head office costs. This is what you have to do anyway, independent of how many mini-grids, how many customers you have. You need to add a little bit more variable cost to also run a significantly larger utility compared to what you see here on the left-hand side. And then your electricity sales also increase, and you finally can become financially sustainable. So therefore, in your AMP pilot systems, don't try to minimize your project sizes and say, okay, we want competition, and therefore we divide this $1 million into 5 companies. That won't work. All of these 5 companies will go bankrupt. So rather, think of economies of scale and say, well, let's rather select one company which will have the ability to cover the fixed cost and the variable cost with a significant number of kilowatt hours sold. That requires scale, that requires a large number of customers, a large number of mini-grids under one management, right? That is the way towards financial sustainability. So what can mini-grid OPEX be, right? OPEX is the operational costs, like everything that you need to pay for maintenance, for operation of your systems. So OPEX can also be expressed in US dollar per customer and year. And well, common OPEX figures range between 30 and up to 80 US dollars per customer per year, or 2.5 to 6.7 US dollar per month, right? And here are some, here's some data from ASMAP, like World Bank, ASMAC, AMDA. We've seen that before, African Minigrid Developers Association, or from RMI. And they come to similar ranges of OPEX with their respective sample sizes. And they say, yeah, well, 30 can be the lower limit. But now think of a revenue of an individual customer, which can be as much as $4 per month. And you have a total revenue of 12 months into $4, which is $48 per year, and you already have to pay something between $30 to $72 or $30 to $80 for the operations. How can this ever be profitable, right? So therefore, that is where you see you need larger customers, you need productive users, you need anchor customers to cross-subsidize the lower revenue customers and make sure, well, after all, you want to connect everyone, right? You're not just doing this to be profitable or to be financially sustainable, but you also want to electrify, right? That's the major aim. So therefore, you connect everyone, even those that, after all, will not be profitable customers. So mini-grid CapEx, we've already had a look at that yesterday a little bit. Here are some example CapEx from ASMAP in 2017 per kilowatt peak are up to 7,500. This is on the higher side nowadays. AMDA says 6,200 in our financial model yesterday. Churchill says we should set it to $2,500. And we are going into that direction. These are a little bit old numbers already. So PV panel costs have gone down, battery prices have gone down. But you as government, you can also contribute a lot to this, because large parts of the CapEx nowadays for mini-grid companies are import taxes, duties, government charges, and these kind of things that add to the total CapEx price per kilowatt peak. So if you divide the CapEx by US dollar by connection, you are in the range of maybe $1,800 to $1,200 per connection. So, and from there, you can then provide subsidies, right? You can subsidize this down to reasonable levels where finally the system can become financially viable. Now, this is now a split of CapEx, right? Management is usually 6%. PV panels is one wouldn't expect this. Like it's just 10% of the total cost, right? A PV mini-grid, solar PV mini-grid, just 10% of that is actually going into the panels. Batteries 15%, inverters 8%, BOS 6%. So the distribution network is 26%, right? If you add all of this as like the 10 plus the 14 plus the 8 plus the 6, so that is still the larger portion, right? But 26% is distribution networks on average. Of course, if you go for medium voltage, then this percentage increases drastically because you basically build two distribution networks on top of each other. You add the transformers and a lot of cost. Land, logistics, installation, taxes and duties, and then there is something that people could not allocate with 0.3%. So, and these 10% here, of course, 11%, 11.5, that is where government can, of course, come in and reduce. So yesterday, we also discussed about financing and investing. Right now, let's have a quick look into what financial products for mini-grids look like. After all, in the financial model, you need to set all of these assumptions, right? What is the grant amount? How much can we expect mini-grids to provide from, like mini-grids financials to provide from debt? How much equity do mini-grid investors need to inject? So, and here you see that there is a significant grant portion, equity and debt, and grants and subsidies are usually used for feasibility studies, then partly the CapEx with focus on distribution networks, right? The fixed assets, those that cannot be moved anymore, are preferably financed through grants. And then the promotion of productive use, which is usually also not really a profitable activity for the mini-grid company, needs to be covered by subsidies and grants. Equity is usually when you have already shown that your project can be viable, then you get expansion capital that comes from equity, investments in operating assets, and overhead cost, especially during the development period. And then the debt comes in only once you really have shown that you can have a long-term profitability in your system. Otherwise, banks would never inject any capital into your mini-grid company. So after all, you need a project portfolio, and you get a loan for that for scale up. And also you need a certain size, right? Banks wouldn't consider any injection below $10 million usually. Just in rare cases, they do something like 5, but that is already the exemption. Right? 10 million is usually the lowest that they do. And that is only the debt portion. And if you then consider here, this could be, the debt portion could be 50% of the total, then you're looking at a $20 million mini-grid project. And below that, there's no chance to ever get that into the system, right? You are only relying on grants and equity. And in these cases, the grants probably take a much larger share. So in real numbers, you can see that the availability of funds for the mini-grid sector has changed in the last few years drastically. This unfortunately only goes to 2020, but as I said, AMDA will publish an update of their study in a few weeks. So then we get more updated numbers. Who are grant providers? Who are equity and debt providers, right? As you know, grant providers, UNDP, USAID, Shell Foundation, World Bank, and so on. Equity providers are there. Here are some examples, and debt providers. You can have a look at this later. I don't think I need to read them out to you now. So, and from here, I hand over to Churchill, who wants to introduce some takeaways from his DRE exercises.
Thanks, Nico. And the point of this section also is just to highlight why de-risking is important and how it links to the rest of the work. So building on what Nico has already spoken to, there's different types of sources of funding, and that can include grants, which is a big part of what's supporting mini-grids at the moment, but also that there's equity and there's debt. And when you're having an equity and a debt provider, they have return expectations, and those return expectations lead to have a big impact on things like the tariff, the cost of generating electricity. And so this screen, what you see on the screen is just intended to highlight why the financing cost is important. So the returns that equity and debt providers expect can be quantified in the form of the financing cost or the cost of capital, and that it also matters very specifically for renewables. So what you see on the screen is just the levelized cost of electricity in this case. So the cost of generating electricity for a mini grid that's powered by a PV plus a battery and a diesel-based system. So on the left, and in that case, you have a low risk environment. And here, the financing cost or the cost of capital is low. And then on the right, you look at how these costs change when the financing cost or the cost of capital increases. And you see that for renewables, it's really, really an important input. And so what we're trying to do with the de-risking work is looking at how do you then reduce this financing cost. You can click on to the next slide. Thank you. So I don't know. Yeah, and click one more time. And so the way that we look at the returns that the investors and debt providers expect is in the WACC. So if you remember yesterday in Niku's presentation, when we were looking at the models, there was one model where there was the calculation of the weighted average cost of capital. And essentially the average cost of capital is a combination of equity and debt. And so the formula on the screen just illustrates this briefly. So you basically look at your debt to equity ratio for a specific project, and then using that, you multiply it by the cost of equity and the cost of debt. So on to the next slide. Yes, and so because the return expectations have a huge impact on the cost of renewables, the question is then how do you then address this? And one way that you can do this is through de-risking. And when we are talking about de-risking, you're essentially doing three things. So what you see on the screen is just a figure that's intended to illustrate what we mean when we're talking about de-risking. On the x-axis, you have the risk of a specific investment. On the y-axis, you have the expected financial return. And then the line just basically shows the different options for investment that you have. You can click all the way to the end. I'll just speak through it. And so typically a mini grid is below the line, right? So you're finding that an investor is taking a much higher risk, and they're not getting the returns that they would expect for taking that risk. And so then it's the job of the public actor to then bring that dot to the green side. So you can click one more time. So typically the way that we have done this is through grants, right? And what grants do is that they compensate the developer for the risk that they're taking. And you can see that with the grants component, so it moves up, but it doesn't necessarily change what happens in the x-axis. So typically the risk may still be there. On the other hand, what you can do is you can reduce the risk as a public actor. And in this case, you can do it using policies, policy and regulation. So a lot of the work that we are doing at the moment, even with AMP, so supporting with policy, development of policy, other actions by governments can be things like setting electrification targets that clearly demarcate specific regions to mini grids. Another option is to look at financial de-risking. So you're transferring the risks from the private sector to the public sector. And an example of an instrument would be something like a concessional loan compared to a commercial loan. And the thing about concessional loans, for instance, is that the interest rates are typically much lower, and they have much more favorable conditions in terms of the payback. And this is essentially what we're also doing with the work on de-risking. So we can go to the next slide, which is we're trying to talk to these investors and to understand the perceived risks that they face when they're financing mini grids. This is a much older version of this analysis, but it's intended to just illustrate what we're doing. So what you see on the screen is, we call it's a financing cost waterfall. We ask investors, what is the cost of equity that you expect? We look at a best case country, and then we identify the underlying risks and barriers that contribute to this financing cost. And then building on that, we then are able to select policy and financial de-risking instruments that can be put in place to address a lot of these issues. So you can click one more time, and within the in addition to doing the de-risking analysis, the Africa Minigrids program is already supporting countries to address some of these issues. So for instance, the discussions around the national dialogue on delivery models, depending on the country that you're in, are helping address some of these pain points that are hindering formation of a mini-grid market. There's other aspects like the digital and the mini-grid pilot component, which is dealing with things around the end user credit risk, so the ability of users to pay, which also manifests in the form of demand risk. And then finally, another one which will be coming up for quite a few mini-grid programs is the financing facilities for mini-grids. So overall, the point that I wanted to just highlight is that, equity and debt providers have specific return expectations. It's a function of the risks that they perceive about the environment that they are investing in or financing, and that it is possible for the public sector to address these risks through de-risking beyond grants in the form of policies and financial de-risking. Thank you, and over to you, Nico.
Yeah, thank you, Churchill. Like, risk is indeed the main issue of mini-grid companies, and the demand risk is, as I said before, probably the largest risk that mini-grid companies would face. If you can just sell 20% of what you could potentially produce, you cannot be profitable. If you sell 90% or 100%, then you are most likely profitable. So the demand risk is the highest, but there are many other risks, like foreign exchange risk, as Churchill just said, many other risks that need to be considered. So as soon as you have a solution to the demand risk, there is more to do. Good. Now I would like to guide you through some productive use and rural industrialization opportunities. We have used the word productive use quite sometimes in the presentation today, and we said productive use is one opportunity to improve electricity demand, to increase electricity demand and bring the demand, like accelerated demand increase over time, as well as bring the demand to a level where mini-grids companies can finally operate sustainably. And there are different options here, right? So this is an electric mill, a converted diesel mill that has been converted to electricity. Let me tell you that, this has been an experiment which has worked, but there are better options, right? Don't try to convert mills, like diesel mills, with the existing diesel mill optimized grinding side to electricity. Rather, use electricity operated and powered hammer mills, and then standardize your rollout plan. Rather, replace the complete mill. That usually leads to a better efficiency of the mill, and therefore the competitiveness of the electric mill can be better than the diesel mill. Otherwise, people may opt to go back to the diesel mill when they see that their diesel fuel price has dropped, and then the operation of the diesel mill is cheaper than operating the electric one. Welding is another very regular and frequent electric productive use. This is, of course, a bad example, as the welder is not using any personal protective devices. No proper shoes, no glasses, these kind of things. But anyway, you would see these types of systems very often. And here I can just advise, when you go into welding, make sure that you use electronic welding machines, because the inverters of solar, especially solar, but also wind power systems, are not made to cover the current peaks that come from a transformer-based welding machine. So go for electronic welding machines, which are a little bit more expensive, but after all, you probably provide a financing scheme anyway, and then these welding machines also work in smaller mini-grids. Clean water pumps, pumping of water, cleaning of water is a very nice productive use, which can help a lot of businesses, cafeterias, and various other businesses that are related to production of food Yeah, you just must make sure that the water is actually clean and you don't pump dirty water through the pipes. Bakeries is something that doesn't happen very often, right? Ice cream smoothies, popcorn making happens very often. You find it everywhere. It's a very low-hanging fruit, not much training required. And after all, there can be some basic income from that. So after all these productive uses is what we call like bottom-up productive use. There have been a lot of experiments around productive use promotion and training on business establishment and grant funding for productive use appliance and all these kind of things. But so far, let me tell you, none of the African mini-grid companies has ever become none has ever become profitable just because of productive use campaigns. Right? You need to be more creative than this. It's, of course, a very nice component, and you should embrace this component and promote bottom-up productive use because it supports the community to develop. It creates some livelihoods for some individuals, but it doesn't make mini-grids profitable. It's not the big anchor customer that you're looking for to make your mini-grid sustainable in the long term. So, but there is another way of looking at things, and that is what we call rural industrialization. So usually, rural production is rather unviable, right? Rural production of rural goods. And therefore, processing companies from the agricultural, large-scale processing industry, or from the mining industry, or from the timber industry, or from the livestock industry, from the fish industry, and so on, they usually get the raw products from rural areas and bring them into their factories, right? So because that is the way they do it. And in some even very remote rural areas, this is even not possible because the transport cost over hundreds of kilometers into the urban trade hubs is simply too expensive. And after all, the product may even arrive at low quality or even perished, right? And therefore, in some communities, they simply cannot sell to the national or international market their products, right? Their products that they have in the communities. So this changes when you introduce a mini-grid, but the mini-grid alone will not do the job, right? This thing will not happen automatically. It requires government interaction. After all, if you implement some local pre-processing, right, around these rural mini-grids, I'm not talking about small mills, right, for local production. I'm talking about setting up factories, right, semi-industrial or industrial style factories in rural areas to produce dried fruit from fresh fruit, to produce deep frozen, cleaned and degutted fish from freshly caught fish, to produce dried chili, for example, from fresh chili. And if you set up this local pre-production, you would probably ask, well, why would African companies do that? It's so much effort, and it increases the complexity. They would do it potentially for conservation. They would do it to reduce the transport costs, because you can reduce large amounts and large weights of products by local processing to be more like smaller and more lightweight. So for example, think of groundnuts. You reduce the shells. You can put a lot more groundnuts into one transport if you remove the shells on site instead of just delivering the complete groundnuts, including shells, to the factory. Right? This reduces the number of lorries, so to say, and then suddenly the goods after transport can be competitively priced and come at a higher quality because they have been conserved on site. Think of the chilies, for example. If you bring fresh chilies over 1 day or 2 days into the urban trade hubs, then they may have developed aflatoxin and cannot be sold anymore. But if you dry them on site, then you have optimum quality chilies that arrive in the urban trade hub at good quality and at a low price. Right, so that is rural industrialization. And rural industrialization means, after all, that US governments motivate industry players from the agricultural sector, from the mining sector, and all the sectors that I mentioned earlier, to go into rural areas where they anyway get their resources from and decentralize their processing. That would create jobs in the rural areas, that would create regular income to the people, that would reduce their vulnerability against climate change, because they have a source of income which comes and on a stable basis. So after all, this rural industrialization is what many governments have put into their policies. Think of Kenya, think of Nigeria, think of Uganda. There are many, many countries in Africa which put rural industrialization very high on their agenda. And I believe that mini-grids are the way towards achieving that. So what can governments do? Let's start on the right-hand side, to support first the bottom-up productive use support. This is like the small mills, the popcorn makers, the small freezers and the small fridges, and maybe the welding machines and so on, for local produce, for local consumption. They can offer training programs for local entrepreneurs. They can offer subsidy programs. They can offer support. They can support microfinance institutions and deferred payment schemes. They can standardize high quality and low cost productive use appliances and machines to make sure that only good machines are being sent out to the rural areas. And they can work either through the mini-grid companies or through microfinance institutions that collaborate with the mini-grid companies. So now, what is required from governments for bottom-up productive use significantly differs from what is required for rural industrialization support. And also, the people who are addressed by this support are completely different. Like on the right-hand side, on the bottom-up productive use support, you address the mini-grid companies, you address the end customers of the electricity to become productive users. On the rural industrialization support, you don't address the end customers. You don't really address the mini-grid companies. You address the value chain players that are already active on the industrial scale in the value chains, that already receive their raw products from rural areas and motivate them to invest into a decentralized production. With, for example, tax incentives, subsidy programs, long-term low-interest loans, support for rural internet access rollouts, information campaigns about natural resources. Some companies may not be involved in rural trade already, and they may want to learn about where the natural resources are and how they can improve their margins by tapping into these resources, working with rural communities. And then consider rural industrialization potential in electrification plans, of course. Right, and tell people, well, here there is a potential in mining. Well, if you set up a mini grid there, then these artisanal mines can potentially be professionalized. The negative environmental impact can be reduced by introducing more professional ways of processing the ore that you basically get from the mines, and these kind of things, right? And after all these measures are then addressed to those industrial processing companies that are decentralizing parts of their production to their own benefit. So there are studies which show, and also real life cases where industrial companies are already doing this. There are cases where it can be shown that this activity of rural electrification and decentralizing the processing actually increases the margin and increases the profit. And this is, of course, what needs to be promoted more, because, as I said before, it comes with a lot of additional complexity and effort. Nobody wants this effort, right? So why would I do that? I would do that if I get an incentive to do it, and then I implement all these additional processes, and then I can increase my margin, and then everyone is happy because I will also pay more taxes that finally pay back the investment that the government made into the industry in the first place. So, and where all of this happens, then micro utilities can link up with the industry players and create management synergies and finally electrify the communities, because the agri-processing companies would not automatically do that by themselves in most cases. They would say, yeah, well, I can set up a decentralized production facility, but I need somebody to supply electricity to me. And then I purchase that electricity. And then suddenly you have your anchor client, right? And that makes mini-grids financially viable. And that's where then micro utilities, mini-grid companies would say, yes, that's what we've been looking for. And the interesting part is that in most African countries, you already have these micro utilities active. And they are just waiting for these types of opportunities. So this is an opportunity for governments to act. Good. Last subject for today, before we then go into the exercise. Full financial model versus cost of service model. When do I use what? Like yesterday, we first went to the full financial model. We also went through the cost of service model, and I already explained, well, the full financial model provides full overview of long-term profitability. You use it when you want to plan a project and you want to project cash flows and revenues and costs and everything over 20 years, over 30 years, to understand how the project works financially. It requires 20 to 30 years of electricity demand projections, as I said before, which is, well, basically impossible to do accurately for mini-grids, as we've seen in the Bangladesh case earlier. It requires storage, like if you want to simulate backwards, right, and want to monitor a mini-grid project with a full financial model, you need to have the exact financial data, each like financial statements of each of the previous years. And if you're in year 30, you need 30 financial statements for each of the previous years, which is a lot of effort, right, to actually evaluate, to keep in stock, to actually make sure that this data is always available, even in year 50, right? So the use case, as I said, is for project planning, for subsidy calculation maybe. What you use is, what we introduced yesterday, is the AFDB Green Minigrid Help Desk financial model, which is a very nice and relatively simplistic example, but still comprehensive for modeling of minigrids. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you have the cost of service model, which is also based a profit and loss on the profit and loss scheme, and where you can actually look at the individual year and calculate the profitability and the sustainability of the mini-grid for this specific year. You can also make small projections into next year, the year after, or 5 years ahead. But you basically look at the individual years individually. So it does not provide the full overview of a long-term profitability. Of course, you can run profit and loss models or cost of service models for 20, 30 years, but that doesn't make too much sense, right? In that case, you probably want an IRR and an NPV at the end, which you have as KPI that you can compare to other projects and see which one is better and which one is worse. So therefore, for these types of long-term planning, you rather use the full financial model. So for tariff setting, however, the cost of service model is ideal because you don't need to store a lot of data of previous years. You just look at this 1 year of next year or this year or the year after, and then you calculate your tariff for this specific year. And there is one model which has become the standard for tariff modeling or project monitoring of mini-grids in Africa, and that is the AFUR Tariff Tool. And later, we will have a deeper look into that tool. Use cases. Tariff calculation. So use the cost of service model. Consider demand, risk, and price elasticity as we've seen today. Don't forget the price elasticity, because as soon as you forget the price elasticity, everything that you calculate will just be wrong, right? Run the iteration cycle. Don't forget the iteration cycle, because again, it doesn't make sense if you don't do that. Full financial model, one-time subsidy calculation. Like if you want to calculate the subsidy, you use the full financial model to fix the tariff and adjust demand according to price elasticity. Again, don't forget the price elasticity. Be aware that your long-term demand projection most likely deviates significantly from the real values, because today, before electrification, you cannot say if there will be a factory 15 years down the line, or if there will be none, right? You cannot say yet. Maybe some politician or so is very active and says, hey, let's bring some investors into this area, right? Minigrid companies could benefit from that, would need to extend their generation distribution capacity and then supply. So consider various possible demand development scenarios in sensitivity analysis on demand. So you need to look into, okay, what happens if the factory comes? What happens if the factory does not come? What happens if the productive use picks up, the bottom-up productive use? What happens if, well, everything stays as is? Can I still be sustainable? Can I still pay my ongoing cost? Right? And these scenarios you need to run to understand where the sensitivities are and where the mini-grid operation stops being sustainable, and probably if it's unsustainable, it stops operation. And then there will be no more further electricity supply. So we already discussed stage subsidy calculation. That is a nice thing for the cost of service model, where you can say, okay, well, next year you have a higher demand, and to actually keep the tariff constant, because we don't want large tariff jumps, we need some additional grants. And that additional grant, if we inject it, you can expand your system and keep the tariff constant and supply all the customers and become more viable, and after all, stabilize your financial viability. Calculate every year or every third year and adjust required grant amount to keep tariffs constant, right? Of course, it would be nice to have various stages in year 3, in year 6, in year 9, in year 12, but remember the square root shaped curve, which is the regular development of demand increase over time. So if you have one stage in year 0 and one stage in year 3, you probably have already covered a lot of the risk that you see in the demand development here. Consider staged implementation to overcome demand risk, right? That's what I just said. Feasibility study. Many of you are currently in a feasibility study stage, so therefore it may be interesting to know which model to use. It's a full financial model that you usually use. Be aware that your model most likely does not match reality if you do a 20-year demand projection, but well, that's what the sensitivity analysis are for. So last but not least, tools that can help in processing data as inputs for financial models. And I don't want to go deeply into this, just want to mention there are some resource assessment tools, right, where you can see how much wind there is in a certain area, how much solar irradiation there is in a certain area. There are system design tools, like there is a free 2 weeks homo usage period. I believe after that you need to pay the SMA. Off-grid calculators, of course, focused on the SMA inverter products, but it can still be used also for general simulations. This is a free of charge tool. PVSys is a commercial tool. And with that, let's come to an end with this presentation and go into the more active discussion of the AFUR tariff calculation tool. But before, maybe there are some questions or comments.
Thank you, Nico. I will let people think of any comments or questions as I set up the breakout rooms.
So are we going to do the breakout discussion now, Nico? Which one are we going to do? Which model?
As you like, as you like. Well, one way would be that I guide everyone through the AFUR tool, and then we go through the exercise together, or you can do it in breakout sessions, as you like. Maybe we can have a feedback from everyone.
If on the call, I'm just seeing. So
yeah.
We would only be 2 people who would be able to do it. But like, I think we didn't align fully yesterday exactly which tool we finally going to use. Did we? So I'm not sure I'm able to fully explain.
Okay, well then let me guide everyone through the AFUR tool. I can anyway put it into the chat. Just need to find the right one here. because I prepared the tool with some, oh, okay, I first need to stop using it, and then I can put it in here. And then I open it
I think there
again.
is a question as well from Dage.
Yeah, I was going to say, Darge, would you like to jump in?
Dagi, you're muted. You would have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, this capacity building in terms of subject matter, yeah, in the mini grid space, in terms of financing, in terms of innovative technologies are very important for the advancement of the Africa mini grid program. So coming to my point, maybe I would like to compliment on the demand risks raised by Nico. These are very important. In addition to the points raised by Nico and even Dr. Churchill, I see that when you come to Africa, particularly in my own country, there are visible demand risks. That is particularly in connection with resettlement, as well as this urbanization. The urbanization is nowadays revolutionizing. Not only grid arrival, because the urbanization is concentrating toward existing urban centers. Because of these, these mini grid applications or mini grid schemes and technologies may become stranded asset, which can affect directly, the demand side of the equation. The other is, the quality of base load demand with respect to productive use and industrialization. The fact that renewable energy technologies and renewable energy resources are variable, because of this, this industrialization and some demand from rural industries may over exceed that of the technology, and as well as the meeting the demand potential of the industry may be another challenge to this aspect. And the other is in terms of these financing tools and instruments. There was presentation by Nico, experience of Bangladesh and from ID call. Is there such experience of like demand projection for one of the African countries, can be for Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda? So thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dage. The first question was around main grid connection, main grid encroachment to mini grids. Yes, that is something, one aspect that we have not addressed yet, but we can look into this when we look into the AFUR tool and how this can be considered from a regulatory and government perspective, and how this flows into the tariff calculation after main grid connection to, like, for mini grid companies that become a power provider feeding back into the main grid, or a retailer of electricity that they receive from the main grid and they retail to the community. This has been already covered in the AFUR tool. We can look into that. The second question, or the second comment that you had, was on the availability of electricity for industrialization. And yes, existing mini grids, if an industrial player comes and wants to connect to an existing mini-grid, then in most cases, the existing mini-grid would not be sufficient to supply electricity to the industrial plant. So therefore, an additional investment would have to be made. But that is, again, for the government to set up adequate funding programs, grant funding programs, like loan programs with low interest rates and long tenors to support the industry in increasing the generation capacity and distribution capacity of the existing systems to cater for the demand of rural industries. And then I would like to remind of the economies of scale that we discussed briefly. So the larger the system size, the lower the tariff can be after all. That is, again, one of the questions or the comments that you had. How does the variation of like seasonal variation and daily variation of availability of renewable resources play into this, as we have so far in our diagrams mainly looked at annual kilowatt hour consumptions. And yes, again, this is a very valid point. We need to consider seasonal and daily variations. But, well, there are also measures to overcome this, right? On the one hand, you have your industries, which have a more constant demand for electricity. Like if you have a very variable demand and trying to match that with a very variable supply, then you have a lot of surplus electricity, a lot of excess electricity. If you have a more constant demand and you have your variable supply on top, it's easier to design your battery system, your storage system, maybe your diesel backup system if required to meet the demand accurately. And then there are also new technologies coming online, which are, for example, edge computing for artificial intelligence, where decentralized server farms are required or are being set up to offtake low-cost electricity that is surplus electricity from mini-grids or from other generation stations. And that could then be operated to offtake any excess electricity and convert that into a certain small revenue for the company. So this is, I hope I answered to, like, I responded to all your comments. If I forgot anything, please come back in and remind me of what I've forgotten.
Thank you very much. This is very enough, more than enough clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
I think there was another hand.
I think
Yeah.
had his hand up, but then lowered it again. Tarek, do you still have a question?
I think in the interest of time, I really lowered my hand kind of things so that I can take it up differently later on kind of things. I have a couple of points to really make here. That first of all, thank you so much. This is a great presentations and great, explaining things. And it gives me one understanding that we seldom go and advise the government that let's do the piloting on mini-grid or let's really make some prepare a project proposal for mini-grid installations in particular community without knowing the technical details of it and recommending that is a very wrong options kind of thing that we have been practicing. So I have a sense that if this training could be also made in a manner where it is suitable for practitioner level, in a sense that I have a feeling that there's a need for basic energy economic understanding in order to really grasp most of the slide that you have shown kind of things. So it might be good for UNDP to really also have another simpler version of the things that are targeting the practitioners in the areas of environment and climate change kind of things. So that, because, let me put it in one simple way, that you talks about rural industrializations. In Somalia, we are working with the coastal communities, off-grid coastal communities, where we are also putting facts that when it comes to desalination plant and also when it comes to solar powered, ice plant. So meaning that the slide that you have shown, consumers and consumption, one slide, that sometimes 4% of consumers can cover quite a large bit of consumption kind of things. So it might be good that we get something with some, successful projects and failed projects as an illustration. When you really explain the graph and come with the fact that, what are the roles of the regulatory body, energy regulatory body, and also the policy inputs that are needed in order to really make sure that it's successful. As an UNDP professionals advising the government, I think those are very important kind of things. This technical training is very important, but I think in order to really take the training knowledge into an applied version, it would have been good that we get it into that level with examples. Let me tell you an example. I'm coming from Bangladesh and I'm quite aware of ITCOL, which have been maturing itself for a period of almost 25 years. And actually within a support of government-led, Minister of Finance was really supporting this, and within the led by government officials kind of things, making sure that, renewable energies gets scaled up in Bangladesh rural areas kind of things, also with support from, Gramin Shakti and others. So that is not an ideal situation in most of the countries over here kind of things, where we need to really take things at that level. I thought that might be useful. Thank you so much. It's not a question, but I hope I am able to really convey my message to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tariq.
Thank
Good.
you. Thank
Any
you
other
for
comments?
sharing.
Yeah, Valentina, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nico. And thank you, Tariq, for sharing that feedback. Great. So I think just in the interest of time, I have put the form for further feedback for today's session in chat. And again, welcome everyone to keep sharing their positive and constructive feedback. And for the remainder of our time together today, I might suggest also looking at the reduced number of participants we have now, that we may stay in the plenary and go through the exercise as a full group. How does that sound to Nico, Marie, and Churchill?
Yeah, sounds good. Let me share my screen again. And here we go. So this is the AFUR Minigrid Tarif Tool as of March 2024. This is the latest version that we are aware of in English language. There's also a French version available. And I filled this with some numbers, realistic numbers for the exercise that we now want to go through. The tool consists of a tool user guide where you can then click on the links here and it takes you then to the specific cells here. If I click here, it takes you to the cell where you can actually enter the data that is explained here. So it in detail explains all the aspects of what you need to input into each of the cells. Then you have your input sheet. This is the next one here, which is relatively straightforward. It's a relatively, I like this tool a lot, to be honest. It's basically the input here, the input sheets, where you start off with the plant capacity or performance. It's the nameplate capacity. Here I say I have a 500 kilowatt peak solar photovoltaic system. Then how many hours per year would you like to use this system? The capacity factor in solar photovoltaic, the capacity factor is fairly low, right? So you have something like 1,600 kilowatt hours, 1,700, 1,500, in that range of kilowatt hours per year per kilowatt peak. And that results in some 870,000 kilowatt hours per year. And therefore, these 20% were set to come up with this number. Then we have the availability of 95%, that is expected availability. Energy availability means then 832 kilowatt hours technical grid losses. This is now the 30% are now considering, in my case, here 20% of surplus electricity because of the variable demand and the variable supply, and 10% of actual losses, and then we still have a 15% reserve margin, which makes the energy output come up to 495,000 kilowatt hours. Good. Then on the next chapter here, we look into capital cost and useful life, whereas the capital cost need to be inserted here in column C and the useful life in column E. And then the tool guides us through all the costs. Like here, there is one chapter, subchapter for solar. There's one chapter for wind. There's one chapter for hydro. There's one chapter for biomass. And there's one chapter for floating biogas. And then there is one chapter for general shared assets and interest. And that is a different one. Good. So let's look into this. And as I'm envisaging here a solar plant, as the AMP is really looking at solar in the first place, we have the development cost, and I said $20,000 land. By the way, you can set the currency somewhere. I can show you later where. It's up here somewhere. Here, there. You can drop down, you can select from a drop down list, and there are all different types of currencies, also African currencies, especially in that list. But here, just to make it very easily understandable for everyone, I just selected the US dollars. So land, solar panels. Solar panels, as I said before, it's surprisingly low cost, 75,000 out of a total cost of, let's scroll down, of $1.25 million. Only 75,000 are actually the solar panels. Rack structure, 50,000 inverters, 100,000 batteries, 400,000 balance of system, 35, and so on and so on. Distribution assets, 220,000. You may remember that the AMDA-wide analysis said it's something like 28% is distribution assets. So the 220,000 are in the right range, especially if you now add the installation, inspection, transformers, and metering, termination, service drops, and so on. Then you come up to that number that AMDA also recommended. Now here, the useful lives, of course, PV panels are at 25 years, batteries, inverters at 13 years. Batteries may be interesting, 13 years, as we are now talking about lithium-ion LFP batteries. If you look at old type lead acid batteries, you probably rather look at 7 years or 10 years or so. But here we're looking at 13. You could also say 15 or even more for lithium-ion LFP batteries type. Good. And then automatically here the capital cost is added up, and some grant level has been calculated based on the inputs that we do further below. So working capital 30 days is also included in this calculation. So it's relatively accurate. And it also takes the small items and small cost components into consideration, this model, so that no private sector company can, after all, complain that there are costs that have not been considered. Here we go into chapter 1.4, operating and maintenance costs, right? The operating and maintenance costs again split into variable and fixed cost. You remember we had discussed that today. Central operations cost is then more like the overhead cost. Regulated cost I didn't put in because I hope that regulators tend to not charging electricity mini-grid companies too much or anything at all for their services. So then we say, okay, what portion of the cost escalates with the inflation, for example. And then we look into the grants and subsidies. Of course, this is a preset value for a government's regulator's point of view. But after all, in the sensitivity analysis, you can then play around with it. And this is the task that we are going through today, to adjust the tariff by adjusting the grants that you inject into this project. And here, this model
just I have 5 minutes left, so I think we need to maybe go a little bit quicker through some things.
Yeah, I'm almost through with this page.
Okay, perfect.
So we this model also considers customer payments for connections also under the grant, and then you have the summary of the sources of funding. You have the debt, you have the equity. You can set the debt portion here. So after all, you can then allocate tariffs to tariff customer groups, for example, like who is supposed to pay how much, a little bit more, a little bit less, what percentage of the total cost. And then we go into the calculations. And yesterday, those who had attended the session yesterday already know this model, because this is the cost of service model, which is a revenue requirement model. And this is the formula: operation maintenance cost plus depreciation plus the base rate, which is into the WACC, and then tax allowance. So the base rate is basically the regulated asset base, RAB, which is the remaining value of assets following depreciation. So, and by applying this model, you get for each of the years, you get a revenue requirement: $215,000, $210,000, $186,000, and reducing over time somehow, as I haven't considered any inflation here. And of course, the regulatory asset base decreases over time, and therefore the return on investment reduces. So after all, the average kilowatt hour tariff is then here in the range of 43 cents and reducing. And then when there are here investments into batteries, again, after the end of the lifetime, then it jumps up a little bit and reduces again. So this is how the tariff projection works. So now further down here, you can then see how the tariff is split into the different customer groups. And you see that some are paying more, some are paying less. Yeah, so then there are still some KPIs that are being calculated from a cash flow model, even that runs in the background, and so on and so on. But the most important part is up here, this average tariff. Where is it again? Average tariff. Here we go. So that's the number, 43 cents. So now what we wanted to do is, 43 cents may be a little bit too much. So we may need to increase the grant level. And let's see where we find the grant level here. Yeah, okay, where are we? So here, total capital cost. This is this. So here, somewhere below here, we must have the subsidies, grants, and contributions. So I said out of the $1.2 million, we have $500,000 of a grant. So let's increase that maybe to 800,000, and then click. $800,000 out of 1.5 million are now a grant. So 860 it says, because it adds the customer payments here. And then we have 30% debt, which means 1.6% is equity only. So we can reduce the debt to maybe 20%. Come on, here we go, 20. And then we have 11.6% equity, 20% debt, and 68% grant. So that is a level which you would see quite regularly in African mini-grids, even at that size of the 500 kilowatt range. And then let's look into the calculations and see how the tariff has changed from formerly $43 per kilowatt hour to now $32. And this is the effect of grant funding in this AFUR Minigrid Tarif Tool. And now you can play around with it, because as we said earlier, this $32 price elasticity triggers an iteration cycle. So you probably now have to go back into your inputs and see if the demand is still the same as before, and if the 500 kilowatt peaks is still what you need. Because if you reduce your tariff, your demand increases, and suddenly you probably need a larger plant. So now you go back and say, well, but maybe I now need 600, right? So this is the cycle that you have to run through. And then finally, you go back into your results. And I think we set the grant by percentage or something, because the tariff further decreased. So we would need to find out where things have changed. So this is basically how you work with a financial model. You make a change, you look at the results, you understand where the changes are coming from, what you need to adjust to actually make the model work, until all the numbers that are assumptions are actually making sense. So, and now it's the full hour, and I hand back to Valentina to close the session.
Thank you, Nico. Right on time. Thank you so much for walking us through through this tool. Yeah, I know we are at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for making the time today and yesterday for these sessions. We appreciate you showing up. We hope they were useful. Thank you again for joining, and please keep an eye out for follow-up emails that will be sent with links to our feedback forms. We look forward to hearing from you. We will also send out a recap and follow-up materials via email, and you'll find all of this on our AMP platform as well.
And yeah, feel free. I think there's like an opportunity to reach out to us if you have any further questions, or also, I mean, I think you're all on the community of practice kind of like platform, right? So you could also like message there, and we have some experts on that one who can help answer further questions. Or if you go into the tool, which I think is in the chat, which you can download, then yeah, and you are playing around with it and you have further questions, please do put them in the community of practice chat, and then an expert from our side can answer it.
Yeah, and most of what I presented
share.
yesterday, most of what I presented yesterday and today can also be found in a report that was compiled. That is, I think, a 60 pages report or so. And you can, of course, go into that and read all the details of what I presented yesterday and today in the 4 hours.
And yeah, Emmanuel, just on your chat, may you share the tool? We can also share it again in the email, but it's also in this chat. You can download it from the chat. Nico posted it at 9:35. So if you scroll up a little bit in the chat, you should see it. But yeah, if we can also maybe attach it again, or the 2 tools, maybe also the one we used yesterday to the email, so that all of you have it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, everyone. We'll definitely share everything via email and post it on the platform again. We are setting up a Ask an Expert channel, so hope to see your questions there to continue the conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Take care. We'll
Cheers.
talk soon.